Mindfulness has become quite the buzzword of late in everything from therapy offices to boardrooms to classrooms and beyond, to the point that it can be easy to lose sight of what mindfulness really offers. That's what inspired longtime mindfulness teacher Mark Coleman to write his book, From Suffering to Peace, The True Promise of Mindfulness. I hope you'll enjoy this conversation that I recently had with Mark about the book. Tell us about your book, From Suffering to Peace, and what inspired you to write it.
So what inspired me to write this book is I've been teaching mindfulness for 20 years. I've been privy to the explosion of mindfulness in every sector of society, and I've watched both with curiosity and some concern about when something grows so quickly, there's inevitably some loss of clarity or understanding about the subtlety or the nuance of whatever it is. And so I've been concerned that, as great as it is that mindfulness is reaching so many different populations and different people, that the depth and the subtlety and the nuance of the tradition from which it came from is really been a little overlooked. And so I wanted to both present to a wide audience the power and the depth of these teachings in a very accessible and easy to understand form.
Mm. And how would you define mindfulness?
So mindfulness, as I talk about in the book, is simply clear awareness. It's that capacity that knows what's happening as it's happening. That it's the ability to be present to what is. It's present moment awareness. Clear knowing, clear seeing of our moment-to-moment experience. And it sounds very simple, but of course much harder to actually establish and live with, because we have so many habits of thinking and distraction and being triggered emotionally and being reactive, and just our habits of multitasking and all the challenges with digital screen use. And so it's a simple awareness that we can cultivate and develop and learn to live with in every moment of our life, and we also need to look at what gets in the way.
And how do we develop mindfulness?
So you can develop mindfulness in many ways. Basically, it's learning to pay attention to what you're doing. But since I'm trained in the meditation tradition, the classical way is you cultivate certain meditation practices and techniques. For instance, cultivating attention to your breath, or becoming more aware of your body, or emotions, or sounds, or your sensory experience. So what the book goes into is how you can systematically train and cultivate attention so it becomes just a lived way of being, rather than something you visit every now and then.
Mm-hmm. And what would you suggest as a starting point for someone who's new to mindfulness but is interested in starting a practice of some kind?
Small moments many times is what I like to say. So start with something, some practice, some technique, some meditation. It can be quite a short period of time, 1 minute, 2 minutes, 5 minutes, and then you build over time. It's helpful to know what you're doing, so it's good to have guidance. And then once you develop a formal practice where you're learning to develop that quality of attention awareness, then you can learn to apply that in a more informal way. So once we develop that quality of attention in meditation, say, then when you're having a conversation, or you're cooking dinner, or you're walking the dog, or you're taking a hike in nature, you can learn how to cultivate that same quality of attention and awareness in whatever you do. So there's both formal ways of doing it, like meditation, and then there's informal ways, which is just bringing attention and awareness to any activity in your day.
Mm. You say in the book that self-judgment is a modern epidemic. How so, and what can we do about it?
Well, my experience of working with students over these last 20 years, and there's thousands of students all over the world, one of the main things I see that cause people to be unhappy is the way that they judge themselves, critical of themselves, having possibly high standards, and always thinking about what they could have, would have, should have done, or comparing themselves negatively to others, or only looking at their foibles and flaws. And so we have a negativity bias that neuroscience is telling us about, that we see that which is problematic, negative, threatening. And so that becomes somewhat hardwired, and so over time that becomes a very critical, deeply habitual, negative voice in the mind that if we listen to, we feel miserable, we feel bad about ourselves, we feel either hopeless or deficient in some way. And so unless we bring mindful awareness to it, it just becomes a voice that we think is part of the living room furniture, and the more we listen to it, the more power it has, the more we feel weighed down by that negativity. And so one of the beautiful things about mindfulness practice is it allows us to get to know ourselves, get to know our mind, and actually see which thoughts and mental habits are helpful and which are destructive. And then we can learn how to unhook from them through the practice.
You write in the book about embodied awareness. What is that, and how do we develop it?
Yeah, so that's a really important term with mindfulness. So mindfulness is an in-the-body practice. We often associate meditation with this sort of blissful floating up into the clouds, but mindfulness is really about how do we be present in this moment. And of course, we have a body that's always in the physical present. So the more that we can ground our attention in our physical experience, like right now as I'm sitting, I'm aware of my feet on the floor, my legs on the chair, aware of my breath, my hands moving. The more I'm attuned to my body, the more I'm here. And since mindfulness is present moment awareness, the more we establish mindfulness in the body, then we live with that mindful attention wherever we go. So it's actually a really powerful ally and support for the practice, and allows us to be present wherever we go.
It reminds me of the previous question we just talked about self-judgment, because so many people negatively judge their bodies.
Right, and so we shift out of that perception or image or idea and actually come into the felt sense experience, which is very different than our views and our ideas.
Yeah.
And we can also come to appreciate that we have this very amazing, mysterious, physical thing called body that does all kinds of wondrous things.
Yeah. And what do you most hope that readers will take away from your book, From Suffering to Peace?
My main hope is that they realize that this practice is accessible, practice of mindfulness and awareness is accessible, that they can live with this in their life, that they can use the tools of awareness and mindfulness to know themselves, to understand how to live a life of peace and well-being, how to release that which is causing harm, how to show up kindly with oneself and others. But if I had to crystallize it down into one thing, it would be to know that this practice is very accessible, it's innate really to who we are, and that we can learn to live with it in every moment of our life.